Okay.
No
so
problem.
That goes right underneath, right?
Yeah, it was,
Okay.
okay. Here we go.
Okay.
All right. Okay.
Okay, we're going to continue the meeting. Good morning.
Again.
Thank you for being here this morning for both our special election meeting and our regular meeting. Just as a reminder, the League is a grassroots, nonprofit organization grounded in our nonpartisan policy, meaning we neither support nor oppose any candidate or political party at any level of government. This protects our 501c status, and it allows us to be leaders in civility in the political arena. Our mission is to defend democracy and to empower women. Voters. Women and voters. We continue our efforts to engage and educate voters on upcoming elections and public policy through programs like today's. While we aren't partisan, we are political. Our league has been actively involved in federal, state, and local government public policy for more than 71 years, as evidenced by our longstanding position statements. The topic of constitutional convention was chosen last January. The presentation you will hear today will be a conversation to answer some basic questions regarding what a constitutional convention is and how it might affect our country.
Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our presenters. After the presentation, we'll take questions from you. Please write your questions, as usual, on the cards. We'll come around and pick them up. We may hold off to give them at the end of the presentation, or if it's something that needs to be answered right away, we'll get it to our speakers. We are so fortunate to have Dr. Matt Harris with us today. He is currently an associate professor and program coordinator for political science and applied social sciences at Park University. His academic path started at Syracuse University with a BA in political science and television, radio, and film. His MA is in political science from Stony Brook University. His PhD is in political science, also from Stony Brook University. He's published many articles, presented at many conferences, and we are so lucky to have him here with us today. And some of you may know Linda Trout. She's one of our very own members. She's been a league member for almost 2 years. Her background as a lawyer, director of career services at UMKC Law School, executive director of the International Relations Council, as well as director of strategic engagement for the National World War I Museum and Memorial, has prepared her well to interview our guests today. Welcome, Dr. Harris and Linda.
Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here and to talk to Matt about this subject. It's reverberating a little, which we were assigned, basically, Constitutional Convention, how are voting rights affected? And we need to start by figuring out what a Constitutional Convention is. I have met Matt for the first time this morning, but I see him on television regularly, and I think maybe some of the rest of you do too. He is sort of the expert on KCTV. I'm not sure if you do other stations, but that's where I see you. Whenever something political happens, they come over to Matt and say, will you explain this so that everybody can understand it? And he does a great piece, and I watch those. And I thought, well, this would be the perfect person. And I contacted him, and he was happy to come. So we're very lucky to have him today and meet him in person, not just on the television. So, Matt, when you say the words Constitutional Convention, it can mean a couple of different things, or people don't know what it means at all. So I would like to start by just asking you to explain what it is.
First of all, thanks for having me. This is, in academia, you do a lot of stuff where you write papers that probably nobody reads and things like that. But for me, this is my favorite thing, is just to be talking with people. And also, I think as a professor, I teach American national government every single semester. And the one thing I always try to preach to the students is to be active, involved, engaged. And so groups like the League of Women Voters, I've always admired, because this is what I want for my students when they leave college, is not to just sort of be on the sidelines. So thanks for having me. Now, when we talk about constitutional conventions, and in this case we're talking about Article 5 of the Constitution, and so when we look at the US Constitution and how it can be amended, there basically are two pathways. One is the amendment goes through Congress and then goes to the states for ratification. So a 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate, and from there it would go forward to the states, and 3/4 of the states need to ratify. That's 38 states. And that's the way that every amendment to the Constitution, and there's 27 of them, that's the way that every amendment has been put on the books, is to go through Congress. But there is this other way, and actually it might be helpful to just read what Article 5 says about this. So the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to the intents and purposes as part of this Constitution, when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or the conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress. And then there's a few other pieces to that that are sort of historic, involving what could be amended. So there are these two pathways. And we've only ever used one of them. But the idea of a constitutional convention has gained steam at different points in American history. There was a large push, for example, in late 70s, early 80s, for a constitutional convention that would discuss a balanced budget amendment. And we're seeing a push for a constitutional convention. Recently, we've seen different groups with different aims. One of them is more right-wing, one of them is balanced budget still, another one is term limits. So we see these different pushes, and the thing we have to keep in mind when we talk about a constitutional convention is it can only be called at the request of 2/3 of state legislatures. So that would be 34 states. Now, depending on how you count this, that's the one thing that it's kind of interesting. I was reading the other day. I was reading an entire report from the Congressional Research Survey about federal constitutional conventions. So this is congressional research. This is like the people whose job it is to do research for Congress. And this 30-page report, and their conclusion is basically, yeah, there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot that, because this has never happened before, it's really unclear the shape that convention would take. Things like, what would representation look like? Because all the Constitution says is, if 2/3 of the states ask for it, there'll be a federal constitutional convention. But there are a lot of open questions, such as, could that convention, could Congress limit the scope of that convention to specific issues? What would representation look like? You know, we have the Senate, where every state gets 2 senators, equal representation, but for states. We also have a House of Representatives that's based on population. So would a constitutional convention be based upon, would representation be based on population? Would it be equal? Could Congress then choose not to take forward a proposed amendment that comes from that convention? Does the president have any role in this process? How would the delegates to that convention be selected? So it's important to talk about the idea of a constitutional convention, because depending on how you count it, we're roughly at the point where maybe 28 states have put forward their approval of a constitutional convention. And so we're getting kind of close to that 34 state threshold. And so it's important, I think, to talk about maybe what the ramifications are of this. But the big caveat is there's a lot we don't know about what an Article 5 constitutional convention would look like because it's never happened before.
So why is there a push now? Why did the committee suggest that this be a topic to be discussed? And why are 28 states pushing for this now after all this time?
Well, I think there are a few reasons for that. One is there are big money interests who would like certain provisions to be put in the Constitution, and recognizing that this is probably a more effective way of getting that done than going through Congress. So I think that's part of it. Another part of it is the coordination that's required to get 34 states to say we want a constitutional convention. That type of coordination is just easier now because of technology. It's easier to kind of reach out to people and share language, to sort of put similar pieces forward across different states. It's easier than it was, 50 or 60 years ago. And I think we can see that both the moneyed interests, organized interest groups, and the influence of technology. We see this in other areas where, like, for example, different state legislatures across the country will adopt very similar legislation that's been pushed by some interest group, and it gets adopted in all these different states. So I think that's part of it. I think also there is, I don't think we can sit here and say it's all, big money interests, and because there are, some of this, and like one of the big pushes for, one of the groups pushing for a constitutional convention is, I believe it's called Convention of States, and it's a right-wing movement. It's fairly, partisan or fairly ideological in its goals on the right, but there are also some on the left who think that a constitutional convention could be a good idea. So it's not necessarily a far right thing. This is something that different voices think could be good, and I think one of the reasons for that is our Constitution has not been amended all that often, right? There's 27 amendments. 10 of them are the Bill of Rights, so that's right off the bat. And one of the other amendments repeals a previous amendment, right? The 21st repealed prohibition, which was the 18th. So really only 15 amendments to the Constitution since, the late 1790s. And so if you look at that and the fact that the Constitution, as amended through Congress, hasn't been amended that frequently. The last amendment to the Constitution, the 27th Amendment, which was ratified in the early 90s, was actually something from the Bill of Rights, or that was initially in the proposed Bill of Rights. So that was something that was, put forward to the states hundreds of years ago and then was finally ratified. If you look at the last amendment that went through Congress, it was lowering the voting age, and that was in the early 70s. So there really hasn't been, the Constitution hasn't been amended through Congress in 50 years or something like that. And so I think, regardless of your political affiliation, you might sit there and say, there are some things about our Constitution that we should change. And Congress, we hear this all the time, gridlock. That Congress doesn't seem to get things done, and especially when you're talking about constitutional amendments where you need to hit a 2/3 bar in the House and the Senate, just not very likely. And there are also some things that people probably think that a lot of people think are good ideas that it's just kind of illogical to think that Congress would act on. And I'll give you an example, or maybe the example, would be term limits. The Supreme Court said in a case called U.S. Term Limits Inc. v. Thornton in the mid-90s, the Supreme Court said that you would need a constitutional amendment for term limits for the House and Senate. There was a constitutional amendment that added term limits to the presidency. And so some people think term limits are a good idea. I can see that argument. There's another argument to be made that term limits actually sort of increase corruption and vote buying and lobbying because it creates a revolving door. And so people get term limited out and then immediately go, lobby for this company or that organization. But, a lot of people want term limits. They want to get, fresh blood and new ideas into Congress. But it's probably, just logically, it's probably difficult to envision Congress being willing to limit their own terms, right? Because we've seen members of Congress who serve for, decades on end. So something like that, then, I think it makes sense that people would say, we need a constitutional convention to take this away from Congress, who would probably, want to move in their own self-interest and put this to an entity that's outside of Congress. So I think those are kind of a few of the reasons that that we see constitutional conventions, the idea of of an Article 5 convention sort of becoming more, we hear more about it these days. But I would just add one more thing, which is that this is something that kind of ebbs and flows in American history. As I said, there was a real push for Article 5 conventions in the late 70s, early 80s, really from the 60s through the early 80s on a number of different issues. So this is just something that kind of ebbs and flows, possibly with, people feeling like government isn't, that Congress isn't acting.
I understand that you're unable to say much about it since one has never been held, but I'm still interested in, does each state legislature have to pass the same wording to get there? Like, do they all have to, and could the wording say, we support a constitutional convention for the purpose of term limits or something? Or I understand it's not been done, but what does the research show?
Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting thing because, and depending on the scholars that you look at, they come to different conclusions. There's one scholar I was reading who said that, if you actually look over the course of history, there's 45 states that have outstanding constitutional convention calls. And so by that by that tally, they could hold one at any time. But that's kind of an interesting question, right? Could, if you look at the language that's in the Constitution, and because there are some limitations on what could be proposed, if you look at the actual text of Article 5, it says, provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 in any manner affect the first and fourth clauses in the 9th section of the first article, and that no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. So there was a piece of that, one part of that dealt with slavery and not halting the slave trade. And the other part dealt with you have to have 2 senators for every state. You couldn't take away that. So there is some language in Article 5 that suggests that there are limitations on which amendments can be used. That would tend to support the idea that there could be that limited calls for and a limited purpose of a constitutional convention would be permitted. That that Congress, if they called the convention, could say it is for these limited purposes. Others will disagree and say that a convention has to sort of go where the convention ears, where the delegates elect to take it. And so that's kind of an interesting question, which is like, when states put forward this, because this has happened for hundreds of years now, when states put forward that they want a constitutional convention, sometimes they do it in a limited scope. They say, we want a constitutional convention for the purposes of a balanced budget amendment or for the purposes of term limits. And sometimes they put forth a general call. And so the question of, to get to 34, the number that is necessary to have the convention, Do you sort of tally all of these together and say, well, we have 34 calls, but they're for different things? Do you say, well, if some of these are specific and some of them are general, but we get to 34, can we say we're calling the convention for the limited purpose and sort of count the general ones as also being in favor of, you know, if 30 states say they want a convention on a balanced budget and 4 say they want a general convention, can you say, well, that's 34 for a balanced budget? Because the general ones would be fine with a specific purpose because they're fine with everything. There are also questions about when states call for a constitutional convention and put that forward, do those calls for a convention expire, right? Or are they just open in perpetuity? Can they rescind those? Can states say, actually, we don't want this anymore? Those are open questions. And so, you know, I think when we look at would Congress heed the call for a constitutional convention, that's kind of an open question as to how they would tally the requisite number of states. There's also really an open question as to what if all 50, I guess if it was all 50, Congress would probably be compelled to act. But like if 34 states said we want a convention on this specific issue and Congress said, we're good, what would be the, you know, what would be the mechanism to hold Congress accountable? You know, you'd probably say the courts, but this could also be viewed as a political question, that the courts would kind of say this is legislative business and we're not going to get involved. Obviously, in recent years, the Supreme Court has been sort of less willing to take that stance that this is not our business. But so even the idea of like how that convention will get called, what it means to get to 34 states, and what would happen if Congress declined, those are all open questions. And so, you know, I think we can have a conversation about what could happen if there were to be an Article 5 convention. But that conversation is also based on a lot of there are a lot of balls in the air. And so a lot of the avenues that it could take would depend on, you know, the makeup of the convention, the scope of the convention, and these kind of things that we don't necessarily have firm answers on.
Yeah, very interesting. The last question that I was going to ask is, how would you suggest that a member of the League of Women Voters get involved in this issue? If we are either thinking, I really want that, or, oh, that would be terrible, I don't want that. What could a person, a citizen, a voter do?
Yeah, you know, I would say one more thing and then I'll get to that question, because I think there's one more point that's important. Constitutional conventions, sometimes the goal of a movement for a constitutional convention is not to actually have the convention, it's to get Congress to act. That's what happened with the 17th Amendment. The 17th Amendment is for direct election of senators. Senators were appointed by state legislatures until the early 1900s. And it was with a push for, we're going to have a constitutional convention, that eventually Congress was like, you know, the Senate was moved to be, okay, we should have direct election of senators. So sometimes the goal of these conventions isn't to have the convention, but to sort of put a little heat on Congress to take up a measure through the congressional avenue. But as far as what citizens can do, I would say two things. Because when we talk about constitutional conventions, there's sort of a state element and there's a federal element, right? States make the request, state legislatures make the request, and then there's a federal element where Congress can, you know, set the ground rules or the organization of the convention. So I'd say on the state level, if you really think there should be a constitutional convention or you don't, contact your elected officials. There was a measure that went before the Kansas legislature for a constitutional convention in, I think, 2023. It didn't pass because actually the Kansas Constitution says it needs to pass with a 2/3 vote, and it did not. There's actually there's a federal lawsuit that I believe is pending that's challenging the idea that it has to be a 2/3 vote in the legislature of Kansas, saying that it should just be a straight majority vote. But in any event, if you don't want a constitutional convention, or you do, contact those elected officials of yours on the state level, because they're the ones who will put the motion forward to have the convention. And so, in Kansas, we're one of 50 states, and so that's one towards the 34. And so your elected officials are the ones you can contact, or, campaign for people who are, who you think are gonna, vote for that or against it. The other thing I would say is, on the federal level, contact your elected officials as well, because on the federal level, when there was a push for a balanced budget amendment in the late 70s, early 80s, and when Congress started to think that this could be a real possibility of a constitutional convention, there was some legislation, none of it passed, but Congress started putting forward legislation, considering legislation that dealt with what would a constitutional convention look like? What would representation look like? What would the vote have to be, right? I think there's an assumption, or some of the legislation proposed that, well, it would have to be a 2/3 vote in the convention because you need a 2/3 vote in Congress. And so, but what would it be? Would it be a straight majority? Would it be a 2/3 vote to put forward an amendment? Things like that. Would it be representation equally by state, or would it be population-based representation? How would delegates be selected? So on the federal level, I think if we think about, do we want a constitutional convention, do we not? I think maybe the most important question is, what would that look like? And so on the federal level, if we actually had some legislation passed that kind of put some boundaries, answered some of these open questions, right? Could it be a limited purpose convention? Because the fear with the Constitutional Convention is that a lot of times that it'll just run out of control. That they'll be there for one alleged purpose, and then it'll just be, next thing you know, the First Amendment's been repealed. That may be an extreme example, but and so I think if some federal legislation to kind of set some rules could be helpful for us in determining if this is something that we think is a good idea.
We've gotten some good questions, so let me go through those. The first is, could the abolition of the Electoral College be a constitutional amendment? Has it been proposed?
I think in a constitutional convention, in just reading Article 5, there was the piece about, if I'm reading the language correctly, the one piece that can't be touched is no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. So that says nothing about the Electoral College. So could the Electoral College be repealed through a constitutional convention? I think the answer is yes. I think perhaps a more fruitful avenue is there is legislation that is, it's basically contingent legislation that different states have passed to declare the national popular vote winner to be the winner of the state's electoral votes. I'm sure a lot of you know about this. And it basically only takes effect if 270 electoral votes worth of states enact this legislation. And if they do, then that has the effect of a national popular vote. If you get 270 electoral votes worth of states to say, we're giving ours to who wins the national popular vote. That is, I think, potentially a more fruitful avenue for repealing the Electoral College. Because I would also say this, right? Constitutional Convention, any amendment that comes out of a Constitutional Convention still has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. And getting 3/4 of the states to repeal the Electoral College is probably a pretty difficult bar to clear, because 3/4 of the states is going to mean having to get some of those states who potentially like the Electoral College because it boosts up those states. It gives them more of a voice than they might have in the national popular vote, or it turns them into states that, we all know this, right? That there's basically 8 states that are going to matter on election night. And so, those states might also sort of be like, well, this makes us important or whatever. So could the Electoral College be repealed through a constitutional convention? Yeah, but theoretically, but probably I would say pretty unlikely.
Okay, how do the states signal their interest in in convening a constitutional convention, who declares that interest?
So it goes through state legislatures. It's a state legislature passes a piece of legislation that says that they're interested. The state legislature signals that. Now, states have different ways of doing it, as I was saying a minute ago. Kansas has a 2/3 bar that's in the Kansas Constitution, that they need a 2/3 bar to signal to the federal government. But yeah, it's basically up to each state legislature to make that signal to the federal government, and that can vary in terms of the scope and if they're looking for something specific or narrow, or they're calling for a general constitutional convention. But yeah, it's state legislatures who make that call.
What about the ERA? Where is it in the process?
You know, if I'm not mistaken, maybe, I don't know if you know this, didn't some state ratify it like 40 years later,
Yeah,
but they said it
yeah.
was too late?
Too late, that's.
Yeah, a lot of times in Congress, when they started putting forward amendments, started doing a thing where they put a time limit on ratification. So they would say that has to be ratified within 7 years.
Right.
And so I believe with the ERA, it did not get the number of ratifications necessary within the time period, and so that would probably have to then start from scratch. The 27th Amendment, there was no time period on that piece that was originally in the Bill of Rights, so that was able to be ratified like 200 years later. But they started putting time limits on ratification in the 20th century.
And that's what this next question is, talking about time limits. If 20 years from now we reach the 34 state threshold, are the current 28 state agreements too old?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is we don't know. Because, you know, as I said, there is a scholar who, in a piece in I think 1993, tallied up all the calls for constitutional conventions that we've seen over the history of America, and his argument is there's like 45 of them that have open calls, and so we could have a constitutional convention right now. Obviously, that doesn't appear to be the view of Congress, and so that question of, you know, does it expire? I think there generally tends to be a view that Congress could, that states can rescind their call for a convention, that states can say, actually, we don't want this anymore. There tends to be, that tends to be an accepted viewpoint, but as to the time period, how long do these last for? It's really an unanswered question, and I think, you know, we could sit here and probably think, well, you know, reasonably, right? They called for a convention 150 years ago. Is that still open? Or they called for a convention on this issue, but Congress has since dealt with this issue, so maybe it's moot. But, you know, so we can look at sort of common sense, but we don't really have an answer for that. And so, you know, in reading this stuff, the sense that I get is that Congress will really only feel the pressure to call. The Constitution reads like if there's 34 states, Congress has to call a convention. But my sense is that will only happen if you've got this number and they're all aligned on sort of what they want from the convention, and it happens in a relatively quick period of time. Because without that, I think you're left with this math problem of, well, you had 11 states that wanted term limits and 12 wanted balanced budget, and you know, this one said so in 1972, and so I think without quick action, 34 states on the same page, there sort of always seems to be a way for Congress to sort of say, we don't actually need this.
I think this is one of the questions that your answer is we don't know, but how are the delegates from each state chosen?
Yeah, that's another one that we don't necessarily have an answer to, because in part it would depend on what the format is, right? So The group that is, let me make sure, I want to make sure I have the group name right. The Convention of States movement. Their idea is that in a constitutional convention, each state would get one vote. A lot of the legislation that was drawn up when Congress was thinking about how this would take place was based on either House representation, so the number of representatives that you have, or later iterations, it was the number of electoral votes you have. So 535 members of the convention, and the electoral college votes you have translate to the number of representatives that you'd have at this convention. So part of it would depend on how the voting would take place. And I think it's fair to say that states would have a strong role in selecting who they want to represent the states at this constitutional convention. But there are open questions within that. One of the open questions would be, could members of Congress themselves serve at the constitutional convention? Because that's kind of an open question. You could see why you wouldn't want that, because you could say, well, if you look at the Constitution, the idea of a convention was to take it out of Congress. So then would you want to have members of Congress serving on that convention? But again, it's one of those things we don't necessarily have answers for, and that's where I think some federal legislation could potentially, it's hard to decide, I think the question of should we have a constitutional convention is itself a difficult question. It's even harder when we don't sort of know, the rules of the game.
This question has to do with when you mentioned that in Kansas they had passed, or they failed. They proposed a constitutional convention which failed. So do you know anything more about the status of that, and who was leading that? What group, and was it for a specific question, or was it in general?
Don't quote me on this. I think it was, actually, don't quote me on this. I'm talking in public and it's being recorded. It was related to one of those movements. There's a few different movements that are being pushed for a constitutional convention, and I believe it was related to one of those. There's a balanced budget. There's a convention of states. And then there's one for term limits. I believe it was related to one of those. I think it was Convention of States, but or it may have been balanced budget. But yeah, it was related to one of these broader calls for a constitutional convention. And basically, the Kansas Constitution says that the call for the convention coming from the state of Kansas has to be a 2/3 vote. They got majorities in both the House and Senate, but they didn't get to 2/3. And so it failed. But there's a lawsuit now by a couple of the proponents alleging that it should not have to meet a 2/3 bar. It should be a straight majority. And I don't know the status of where that lawsuit is at. So basically, the call from Kansas that went out, I think it was 2023, for a convention did not pass. But there's some legal wrangling as to what the bar that needs to be met is for the call for a convention to come forward.
I may be wrong, but I think we haven't mentioned yet that one of the big pushes for a constitutional convention is to amend the Constitution to make all abortion illegal. Is that not one of the big issues that people are pushing?
I don't know. I mean, that probably is something that is, I think if you look at the pro-life movement generally, they are trying to fight on all fronts, and that's could be one of the fronts. I don't know how organized that movement is yet, and so when you look at like where states are signing off on calls for constitutional conventions, I haven't seen that one as one of the bigger pushes, but that doesn't mean that that obviously doesn't mean that it isn't happening, or movement isn't happening behind the scenes.
Yeah. I think you've answered this, but I'll go through a couple of these quickly. Clarify, does Article 5 allow Congress to place limits on the Constitutional Convention?
I always tell my students the answer to everything is it depends, and it's probably the case here too. If we read the text of the Constitution and the text of Article 5, I think we could probably intuit that Congress can set a limited scope because there are some limits on what can be amended. And I think if you take that in line with the idea that the states themselves might be saying we put forward a call for this limited purpose, then I think you probably could intuit that Congress can sort of say, well, 35 states want to talk about, overturning Citizens United or whatever. And so we're going to put forward the call with this limited scope because that's what the state said. And we combine that with a reading of Article 5 that says there are some pieces that can be and can't be touched. And I think you could intuit that maybe that could be the case. But if you talk to different scholars, you may hear differently as to how limited. There are some who would argue that the sort of the scope of the convention could be limited to an issue, but it could not be, we are just considering this already worded amendment. It could not be the states have all said, we want this amendment, because that's not really a convention, right? That's just, hey, here's this thing, and in that case, there's no need for discussion, debate. But as to having a more limited scope of an issue, I think there's a reading of the Constitution that would say that that's permissible.
So this question is a little off the topic, but somebody asked it. So in your opinion, why did the Equal Rights Amendment fail to gain ratification? How close did it get? Do you think it's still needed? I'm not a historian. I wish we have a couple great historians at Park, Dr. Tim Westcott, Dr. Deb Sheffer, and I wish they were here because they would probably be able to provide more insight on that. So I guess, do I think it's needed? Yes. Why did it fail? I mean, I think it probably has a lot to do with sort of the history of our country, and the nature of, just generally speaking, the nature of what it takes for a constitutional amendment to be ratified, which is you need to get 38 of the 50 states. And you all know, if you've lived around the country or you've spent time in different places, that the political climates, the liberalism or the conservatism, it can vary greatly based on states. And so 38 out of 50 means it's got to be something that's, look at the 10 most liberal states and the 10 most conservative states, and you're going to need some of each of those in all likelihood to get something passed. And so that's broadly speaking probably, although I apologize, I'm not a historian, although I feel like one with each passing day when I talk to, I'll say something to my students and I'll be like, you guys remember John Kerry? And they're like, who? So. Well, I've gone through the questions, and I think you really explained it to us. And if I could summarize what you've said, I think I would say we don't have to lay awake tonight worrying about a constitutional convention. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this earlier, but I think there are fears of a runaway convention, and I think those are potentially legitimate if we had a constitutional convention because we don't know what the rules would be. But the thing that I think gives me hope, or why I'm not losing sleep about it, is that there's still that 38 state bar for ratification. And so no matter what comes out of a convention, you still need to hit that 38 state bar. And given how evenly divided the states are in terms of, you've basically got, maybe 26 states with Republican legislatures and 24 Democratic or something like that. Given the mix of blue and red states that exists, it's a really high bar to clear. So, yeah, there's a lot of open questions, but yeah, I don't think it's something that's particularly concerning. I think we've got a big day coming up on November 5th, and probably don't have to worry too much about the Constitutional Convention right now.
Okay. Well, thank you, Matt, for coming and spending your Saturday morning with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Answered so many questions that I didn't even know I needed to ask. Bear with us for a few more minutes as we have some announcements. Now, I'd like to highlight an exciting outcome of the recent lawsuit that prevented the League from registering voters directly. We can now go back to registering voters in person. Which is a wonderful thing. Be sure to look at the website or reach out to voter registration team to see how you can help register voters. Want to see how that might work? Voter registration team, you're up. They would like to come up and give a few examples of how to help with voter registration. So Malia is going to be here in just a second, and she will speak.
I've never spoken up here before. My name is Malia Siebert. I'm not sure who I've met in here, but thank you for making me welcome. I joined the League 9 or 10 months ago, and I decided to become a voter reg chair in April with Raquel, and there's a lot going on right now. So I'm just going to ask a couple of things and mention a couple of things that we could use your help with. And first of all, I wanted to mention, I wanted to thank everyone who's already helped us out with an event. And thanks for having grace with all of the things, because there's a lot going on. Thank you if you have signed up for the next round of events. Just to give you an idea as to what's going on, we have 14 total events between August 28th and I think October, I don't know, maybe 5th or 6th. 3 more are yet to be scheduled, but probably will be. So we need help. I think there are 3 or 4 events where we still need volunteers. So that is my plea to you. I wanted to also mention that if you have done an event or are scheduled to do an event, think about like the audience and how frustrating it can kind of be sometimes, because we want to make registering easy, right? Because some people are like, I don't have time. I have found that working with younger voters, they respond well to QR codes. The first event I worked with Marie, I was all ready to hand out a piece of paper, and they had their phones up, scanning the QR code. So for efficiency, that works well. With other populations that might have a harder time with dexterity, or their technical skills might not be as they might not be as savvy, that is where we definitely want to have paper registration forms available. For example, senior living facilities. And so that's kind of the breakdown. Just think a lot about the audience and how they will feel most comfortable. If you are registering people by paper, my recommendation, and if someone disagrees, they can certainly speak up. If they're filling something out by paper, have them return it to the election office and mail it back in. I don't think we should take on that. We could lose it, misplace it. I personally don't think that's something we should do, but that's me, and I'm brand new here, so someone else. I am going to be sending out some additional little tiny snippets on like examples. What to do if someone comes up and they tell you that their birthday is October 20th and they cannot register. Little tiny examples. I want to make sure everyone has the tools they need to feel confident when they go out, right? And then they can address any type of question that may come up. I was really nervous on my first event. Like, I was with Marie, and I was like, don't come talk to me. I was nervous. So I want everyone to feel comfortable and empowered to do that. So I will be mailing everyone some things. We have put together some fun things. We put together some swag. Raquel is the other co-chair. She's really creative and kind of loves it. We have some stickers, some items in the back of the room. So take a look. Again, stickers. A lot of people like buttons, fun buttons, and then bracelets. And you will see these cards in the back as well. They are, I think, 10 to 20 business cards. And they're in the shape of business cards. You can keep in your purse, your wallet, in your car. If you see someone that you may want to give a card to, you can. These are just meant to be handed out. We have items available in Spanish as well. So that's something we've worked on doing too, to make sure we can speak to the population. Let me see. I want to touch base with, I don't know if she's here. Is Debbie Snyder here? Perfect, there you are. I was looking right at you. Okay, I wanted to touch base with her. Anyone else that needs to talk to me, just grab me. I know there are some people. If you have done voter registration ever before or in the past, please let me know. This is all hands on deck. This means, I'm not gonna get all emotional because I think my boyfriend has seen me with tears. I really want to do a good job, and I want all of this to be done well. And I tell my boyfriend how historic all of this is because of the time and other things, and he just kind of looks at me. So, but I think all of you in here know. So we have a countdown, of course, to voter registration, the deadline, not that I'm counting. And please reach out. I know people in here really want to get engaged, and now is the time. And we'll make sure you have what you need to feel comfortable. So I think that's all. I went through a lot, and we are going to be giving away. One thing brand new that we're going to be doing is text reminders for the election. That's brand new. So I am going to, I haven't done it yet, put together like a 20 or 30-second video. The gist of that is we want to encourage people to sign up for text election reminders and a chance to win a gift card. Of course, we want to offer that to everyone, right? Anybody can sign up for the chance to win a gift card. So we're doing those. We're printing off instructions. I know it's available to everyone. So, I am walking through that, and I think my time's up. So
Okay.
there are some questions, but did you want me to answer? Do I have to? Yes, if you don't know, if you go online to our website and make sure you log in as a member. If you don't log in, you won't see all the events to sign up for. If you don't know your username and password, you can reach out to Debbie, who's up there, or admin, the admin website. Yes. Or membership, yeah. Anyone, we can get it reset. That's the first step. Please sign up online if you can. That makes things a lot easier for us. You can also email us, but if you sign up, that's real time. You will be getting a confirmation email from us on the next steps. And there is one more question. No, okay. Any other questions? But I'll be here, so just come grab me and get some things, get some material. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, Malia, for that information. Knowing how much fun it is to register voters, be sure to look at the website to see the events Reiterating what she said, go on the website to find out the events that you can volunteer for. Please note that there is a short mandatory training with the registration team prior to going out to actually work at any event. That information, the training time and date, will be available on the website in the very near future.
Yeah.
Okay, you do that, okay.
Thanks. There's lots of things to communicate, and just, guys, the website is one of our best places. And please reach out to any of us on the board with questions. Membership, wonderful place to get questions answered, so just do that. Yes? You have to be logged in, but yes, then that's the way I understand. Isn't that right? Yeah, just click on the event.
That is right. There's also a link at the very top, which will let you go to volunteering, and then you can see everything displayed in one spot. There is a spot on the very top of Get Involved. It says Get Involved. You have to look at it right now because I forget sometimes. It says Get Involved. Click on that once, and then there will be another area. I think it says volunteering or volunteer.
Yes, thank you. Feel free to play around on the website and get familiar. There is a lot of information on there that you may not even be aware of. So feel free to use that website, and also feel free to reach out through emails, phone calls to any on the board or any of the names. You can see us, we're listed. We even have a picture of us on that when you look at the leadership. So just a couple more announcements. Please bear with us. I know other teams are waiting or looking for volunteers. We have something from our voter information people that need to get some volunteers. Keep in mind, I know I was new to the league and had no idea what the difference was between voter registration and voter information. They're under the same umbrella of voter services. Voter information are the people that put on the meet and greets. They get information out to people. So it's once, hopefully, they'll either be registered and already needing the information, or they can get people interested in getting registered as well. But here are two things from their committee. Marie, in the back, is standing there. She's got some walk-up cards that you can pick up today to deliver to friends and family. They provide voting information to encourage people to vote. So please stop by the table and get those from Marie on your way out today. Now, the meet and greets are coming up. We encourage all members, you don't have to volunteer, but we can always use the volunteers, but be sure to attend those, because that way you get to know the people that are on your ballot personally. You have a chance to talk to them, ask them the questions that you would like to find out. Bring people with you, especially somebody who may not be very active. Bring them so they can learn who is running for office as well. You can come for 15 minutes, or you can stay the whole hour. You can visit with people that may not be in your district, but you still get some good ideas of when you see names in the paper or on the ballot. You can bring children. It shows kids how you can get informed to be a good voter. Also, you could consider posting event flyers around your community. You can get a flyer by going to the event on the website, download that image, and print it up. So if you're going to a meeting and you want to bring it and post it up there for people to know the meet and greets and all that information, please do that. The communications team needs some help as well. Diana is right there. She would be able to answer questions on specifically what she needs. She's the one that gets the newsletter out and does all the stuff to inform our members, to be voters. So there are lots of ways to get involved. This is a pivotal time for us, and we need to have as much information that's good information out in the world.
Okay. So, in conclusion, our next meeting will be October 5th, and the title will be Special Education. our children being left behind in Kansas. Be watching for the next voter newsletter to see who will be participating in the panel. We already have a commitment from the superintendent of Olathe Schools, Dr. Brent Yeager, which is a pretty big deal, and are waiting for confirmation of a couple of other participants. That information will be in the voter newsletter. Again, thank you for your participation in our special meeting, as well as our regularly scheduled program meeting. We are so excited to work with the Presidential Leadership Team, AKA PLT. Thank you to all of you for sharing your Saturday morning with us. We'll see you soon.
So we're good. That was
Okay.
good.
Okay.